What's going on, folks? It's your boy Javier Javier with the Javier Javier Show. Make sure you say it twice. I'm here with my special guest, Chris, and we finna get into some deep discussions on theology. So, what's going on, Chris? How you doing today?
Doing good, Javier. Now, when I say your name, do I have to say your name twice the entire time, or just when I'm talking?
No, you don't. You don't.
Okay.
But it's nice to hear it twice. But I'll even say your name twice.
Well, you almost could because my name is Chris Christiansen.
Oh well, I make sure you say it twice, people. So, with that being said, me and you originally met through Facebook, and we're in a group together. We got plenty of guys that we run in the same circles with and have conversations with. We were on Rob's show together, and and me and you, we were supposed to have this conversation. I think it's long overdue. So, kind of tell the viewers a little bit about yourself and your background.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm about 35 years old. I just completed my master's degree in theology with a special focus in apologetics. I'm married to my beautiful wife, Amy. We've been married just about 2.5 years now. I'm from Vancouver, Canada. I was born at a young age in North Van. Anybody who thinks that, hopefully some people get that joke. And I've been a Christian about 15 years, I guess. I grew up in a Christian family, but I didn't really make a decision to follow it for myself till I was 19. And been to Bible school a bunch, did my BA in religious studies and youth leadership. And my specific interests are ethics. So if you've ever listened to Rob's show, I've done a debate a couple of times on abortion and physician-assisted suicide, and history, debating whether Jesus himself existed, whether he rose from the grave or not. So that's in a nutshell. That's some of my background.
That's some deep things right there. Deep conversations right there. So I'm a little untraditional, so I'm gonna probably try to ask you a few questions that may not be something you might be used to hearing, or you may be used to hearing it. I may just ask it in a different way. So I think a good place to start off is, okay, what originally convinced you to follow or to get in line with theology? What was it that gave you the inspiration to follow theology and try to get your master's in theology?
Well, it's actually a really funny story that way. I have a bunch of learning disabilities, and high school was just absolute hell for me. And for the longest time, I was thinking, man, I'm out. Why would I ever want to go back to that? Especially since you have to pay for post-secondary education. That just seems to be like paying to get tortured in my case. And then, I don't know, I'm going to go a little bit on the supernatural side of it, but it felt like everybody I was talking to were saying, Chris, you should go for your post-secondary. You should do something like that. And it felt like every other door that I tried to walk through to avoid it just kept closing. And so finally I was just like, okay, you know what, God? I was like, apparently you're convinced that I'm supposed to do this. And I'm going to prove to you that this is the wrong thing for me to do. I'm going to go to school and I'm going to do my best and I'm going to fail everything. And hopefully then you and everybody else will figure out that, I'm not cut out for this. Well, my GPA the first semester was about 4.0. So that was kind of the nicest smack upside the head I've ever gotten.
Oh, that's good, man. Well, I've never studied theology like through a university. I'm more self-taught myself. I've done as much research as I possibly can. I've read the Bible 4 times front to back. And I mean, when I say front to back, I mean page by page, front to back 4 times. And I've had a lot of conversations with a theologian in Augusta, Georgia. He taught me a little bit about Hebrew and about how different words translated over, So we had a lot of deep conversations. That's originally how I got into theology. So I'm going to jump right into it. I'm going to ask you this. What does the Bible have to say about dinosaurs?
Well, it depends on who you ask. Um, some people would point to Job, where it talks about a creature with like a tree trunk-like tail and a long neck, or Leviathan about something that breathes fire, and like wades in the water and has all these scales. But if you talk to like a six-day creationist like Kent Ham, he would say that seems to talk about brontosaurs and maybe a flesh-eating dinosaur.
So which are you? Are you a young Earth creationist, or are you more on the side of evolution, billions and billions and billions of years?
I'd fall under the label of a theistic evolutionist or an evolutionary creationist. Um, and so I would understand it as talking about like a hippopotamus, like the one with like the tail like a tree, and a crocodile for Leviathan, and then it's just using kind of poetic imagery to describe that. And yeah, I don't think it would have talked about dinosaurs much because it would have been written well after they were extinct. So
So your impression is, do you think the Bible didn't, the people who wrote the books of the Bible, because I know the Bible wasn't originally one work, but do
yeah,
you know that are you under the impression that they knew what dinosaurs were, or that dinosaurs had once roamed the earth? Or would you say they didn't know? That's why it's not explicitly discussed in the Bible.
that's a good question. My initial thought is they probably didn't know about them, just because yeah they weren't around. They didn't have archaeological digs going on at that time. They didn't care about that stuff. So no, I don't think they really knew about it.
Okay, now I just want to throw the dinosaurs your way because, as you know, I'm an atheist. So me and you are kind of like on opposite sides of the fence, and I'm more curious on.
No,
Uh,
joking.
yeah, I want to know what convinced you. Why are you a believer, and like what makes you not a non-believer? Is there a reason why you chose to believe in God, or what convinced you that God was real?
I was. It, it's a bit of a complicated story, but I'll try to break it down. I, like I said, I grew up in a Christian home, and I was kind of a weird form of agnostic, where I wasn't exactly sure that Christianity was true, but I figured if any religion was true, it was Christianity. And it was because I could see the positive impact that it had on everybody around me. It seemed like there really was something at work in people's lives. Um, but what really made me convinced that even if God existed, he actually didn't give a rip about me personally was the problem of evil. And so for the longest time, it was funny. I actually used to do like ministry and I would evangelize to people. And I was like, and I did it because I was like, well, at least I can help other people find something good in their life, even if apparently it doesn't apply to me, right?
Yeah.
But the funny part is that it just got me more and more frustrated because I was like, okay, these people do seem to have good relationships with God. So why does my life suck so much whenever I try to trust him? Anyways, what ended up happening was I talked to a good friend of mine who was on the same ministry team as me, and I kind of shared with him my concerns. And what he told me was this: he said, Chris, people might have joy as Christians, and that's not the same as them being happy. Happiness is just circumstantial. Joy is something that's like comes with the perspective that this life isn't all that we have. It can kind of give you hope despite circumstances, and part of that joy comes from knowing that God can take a or bad situation and bring something good out of it. And so when I looked at my own life, I could see, not in everything, but at least in some cases, there was good that had come out of the bad. And for
So
me, uh,
so would you say that, are you leading more into it wasn't an emotional decision versus a logical decision? Do you think that you got into your faith based on how it made you feel at first, or were you the type that looked at the evidence and it convinced you? Which one came first for you?
in this case, I think it might have been a bit of both. Um, because there, obviously there was the emotion of just feeling like my life was terrible and that, that seemed to not coincide with a loving God. But then there was a logical side of it where once I could see that what my friend said was true about good coming out of bad, that kind of removed one of the roadblocks for me in believing. So I didn't even know what apologetics was at that time. I only found out about it much later, but
Yeah.
I could definitely say it played a part in my decision to become a Christian.
I think a lot of atheists have a frustration with apologetics, and I'll explain it for this reason. A lot of atheists may feel that apologetics is only the art of confusion. It's a way to muddy the waters so that if you can make something more complicated than it actually is, then those people who are less trained to call it out are more likely to be convinced of it. And I kind of feel that way. I try to avoid apologetics as much as possible because I don't think the average person really cares to get so technical. So what's your thoughts on that? Do you think apologetics is a good thing? Do you think it has a place? And do you think that it's useful in having a conversation like me and you are having right now?
I think so. Technically, all apologetics means is giving a defense. So if you've ever defended Trump to fellow atheists and said that you're completely, what's the word, justified in trusting him as a leader, you're doing apologetics for Trump.
Well, let me tell you this real quick. People don't defend Trump. People have to defend themselves on why they support Trump.
Okay, so what you'd be doing then is Javier apologetics.
Just a little good joke.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, so I mean, sorry, brain a little bit frazzled, but the thing with it is anytime you give a defense for something, you're doing apologetics, whether you call it by that name or not. And so, even atheists do apologetics in some shape or form, even when they say that I don't have to give any positive reasons for being an atheist. I'm just going to tear down all the arguments Christians put forward for it. That's negative apologetics right there.
How? Okay. Let's stop there.
Sure.
There. This is about to get interesting. Okay. So the Christian says there is a God. The atheist says, I'm not convinced. Explain further. Christian tries to explain to the atheist, these are the reasons why God exists. And the atheist responds, that doesn't make sense. This doesn't make sense. And you consider that to be apologetics?
Sure. Because, okay, for example, one type of apologetics that I do is with other religions. So a lot of like comparative religion and whatnot, right? So let's say I'm talking to a Jehovah's Witness and they say that, well, Jesus didn't resurrect with a body. He resurrected just as a spiritual being. My response to that would be, well, his tomb was empty. He said, I have nail marks in my hands and feet. I have flesh and bone. So a spiritual resurrection makes absolutely no sense. That would be a type of apologetic too, in the same way that an atheist might say, the Bible seems to teach 6-day creationism. We know that that's not true from science. Therefore,
your original argument was that apologetics, by definition, is a defense, and the atheist has no position to defend. An atheist is only on the opposition side, but basically, they're on the offense. You're on the defense. Therefore, that's why we call yours apologetics. I don't understand how you would call a offensive apologetics. It goes directly against the definition of defense.
Well, if you can show that another position is inadequate, I would say, compared to yours, I would say that's still a defense of sorts.
Which I could agree, but then you would have to state the atheist claim. What is the atheist claim? Because I don't think atheists claim, I know there's no God, or saying, I believe there's no God. I think the atheist claim is, there could be a God, there could not be a God, but I'm not convinced that there is. provide me some evidence.
Well, see, this seems to be a case where atheists have redefined a word, because I go with Bertrand Russell's definition of it. Atheism is the claim that there is no God. Agnosticism says, I'm not sure if there's a God. So that's what it sounds more like you're describing. And that theism is the claim that there is a God.
Well, if you want to take that as a definition, I don't know any atheists. I would believe that we are all agnostic. I mean, even the Christians. Yeah, I think even Christians are agnostic because there's a level of faith there that they're saying that I hope for these things to be true, even if you have more conviction than another Christian does. There's still a level of faith there because there is so much that you have to put your faith on because you just don't know. And I think atheists are in the same position as like, yo, there could be, there couldn't be. I don't know. But until you provide me evidence of one, I'm going to withhold my belief. I think that's the difference between an atheist and a Christian. So I really don't like the word agnostic. I think it's a cop-out. I honestly think agnostic is a cop-out. Because if you don't have a religious belief, by definition, you're an atheist.
So that would make babies atheists.
Of course.
So how does that tie into atheists being rational when they come to this decision without any rational thought?
Well, I don't think it's a decision. I think I'm not convinced. I don't think it's an affirmation of a position. I just clearly think it's you brought me something, and I'm not convinced. If you can bring me something better, it may convince me. But until further notice, I'm not convinced. If you want to state that as a claim, I don't think I can get in that same boat with you.
Well, your claim is that you just don't know, but the agnosticism is its lack of knowledge. That's what agnosticism means. So atheism is no, theos, God. And in the same way, theism is acknowledgement of God. So they're two very polar opposite ends of the spectrum, where agnosticism is in the center, and that actually seems to be where most atheists sit.
Well, where do you put deism, and where do you put paganism? Where do you put, there are different parts of the spectrum where you can fall. You can believe in many gods. Yep. And on that spectrum, you would also have to put atheists on the opposite side of paganism. So it seems like atheism falls on the opposite spectrum of all religious beliefs. I mean, but I just...
Well, can I try to answer that one first? That's a good question. So first and foremost, even if deism and polytheism, even if deism or polytheism were true, right? That would still mean atheism's false. So that would be...
And I think what we're arguing is the semantics of atheism, because I hear this from religious people all the time, that atheists say there is no God. And I just don't meet any atheists who would ever be bold enough to make that statement. I think it's completely a straw man on the religious side to say that atheists claim there is no God. It's not something that I know of as an atheist.
It's not that we're claiming that atheists themselves are making that statement specifically. There's a couple of things going on here. We're saying definitionally, atheism means belief in no God, the same way that theism is a belief that there is a God or gods. So if you're claiming to be an atheist, that's actually what that claim means, whether that's what you mean by it or not.
So you're saying that we believe in a negative. Basically, you're saying you're an atheist when it comes to fairies. You believe there are no...
I don't believe fairies are gods. So that wouldn't be the same as atheism. That would be afairyism.
Unless somebody worships fairies as gods. Then you would... Okay. So you would say, I don't believe that fairies are gods. Okay. Now, if somebody came to you and say, hey, I saw fairies and they are our Lord and creators. If you said, well, show them to me and I'll believe you. That's not you saying there is no fairies. That's you just saying, bring me more evidence. I don't see that being equal to there is no fairies. Does that make sense to you?
I see what you're getting at with it, but I think I would say that there are. I would say there's a lot of people that would argue that there are no fairies and that we have reasons to think there aren't, right? And I don't honestly, I haven't studied fairies much, so I couldn't give you the exact arguments back and forth on that right now, right? But think about it this way: some people, like atheists, sometimes try to defend this by saying you can't prove a negative, right? But I don't think that's true. For example, we can be relatively certain that married bachelors don't exist. They just can't. It's a contradiction in terms. You can't be married and be a bachelor.
Well, let's play on that thought right quick. If God is real and God is all powerful, could he not create a married bachelor?
That's like can God create a stone so large that he can't move it?
I mean, it's a good question.
So when Christians claim that God is all powerful, have you ever read any works by C.S. Lewis?
A few here and there.
Have you ever read The Problem of Pain?
I've heard other people's representations of it. I have not read it myself personally.
Okay. So this is what I'm referencing on it. But he says what the Christian claim that God is all powerful means that God is able to do things that are logically possible. So in that sense, God would not be able to make a married bachelor because it's just a logical impossibility. And I really like the way that he puts it. He basically says it's not because of some limit on God's part. It's because nonsense remains nonsense even when we talk about God.
So what would you call a person who is married but still is able or open to being in relationships with other women?
They still wouldn't be a bachelor. They would just be polyamorous, I think is the term, isn't it?
Yeah, it's semantics, is it not?
It's semantics, but I think words are important. I mean,
true.
Let me see if I can. I want to try a little thought experiment for you.
Okay.
How would you respond if I said to you, I'm not claiming that God exists. I'm just claiming I don't believe he doesn't exist. Would you say then that I have no burden of proof and I'm not making a truth claim?
Okay, if you said that you're not saying God does exist, you're saying that you believe he does. Say what you said again.
I just don't believe that he doesn't exist. So now I've made it a negative truth claim.
That would be more honest than saying God does exist, because you're still saying that he could and he couldn't. The way that you're setting up the statement, you're allowing that open to be like, well, maybe he does and maybe he doesn't.
But the thing is, if I don't believe that he doesn't exist, that still means that I do believe he exists.
It's not the same as a person saying, I lack belief in general. You're still saying you have a belief. You're still making an affirmation of what you believe or don't believe. I'm not saying I believe this, and I'm not saying I don't believe this. I'm saying, it's for instance, if you found me on the island and I never met another human being in my life, and you brought the Bible to me and I didn't even speak English, would you consider me to be an atheist or would you consider me to be a believer? You wouldn't consider me either or, because I'm not smart enough to say I believe or don't believe what you're bringing me. True or false?
I don't know about what I would call you at that point, because it seems like it's not that you disbelieve in God or whatever. You just don't know enough to actually make a decision about what you believe. But then we're right back to agnosticism.
That's the atheist position. Agnosticism is just a cop-out. An atheist position is, I don't have enough information to make a decision, and therefore I'm going to withhold judgment until I get further information. Go ahead.
I think that's just atheist. Sorry, I think that's just agnosticism calling itself atheism. You guys are redefining terms.
No, atheism existed before agnosticism.
Yeah, but you usually actually used to take the position that God doesn't exist and defend it. And I know it's possible for people to defend it actively that God doesn't exist because I've read atheist books where they do it. Bertrand Russell, Why I'm Not a Christian. Richard Carrier, Why I'm Not a Christian. Richard Dawkins, The God Delusion. Clearly, they do think that they're making it. And here's the other thing. If you guys aren't sure that God doesn't exist, then, and how do I put this? Then I don't think that's something, if other people are sure or they do believe that God exists, I don't think that's a position that you guys can really push as more rational or something that everybody else should follow because you're not even sure yourselves.
Well, there's levels to this. We just at the fundamental level of the definition of atheism. But when you move to the next level, we get into the territory of, yeah, I can't say there is no God, but what I can say is your God is not real. The more specific you get about a certain God, the more likely I am to determine whether or not that God is true or not. That's where the next level comes in at. Let's not conflate those two. You get what I'm saying? Like he said, Christian, why I'm not a Christian, why I'm not a Muslim. You could be a deist, but my argument is not anti-theist. Deist is anti-theism.
But even with deism, that would be some form of a god, right? As long as there is a god, then you can't be an atheist.
No.
Sorry, let me explain. As long as you believe that there is a god out there in some form or another, you can't be an atheist because there's still some sort of deity out there. So that's what I'm getting at. Is
atheism is atheism. It's not a deism. Deism is separate from theism. I never claimed to be an atheism because I could never possibly prove that there is no God. But I can say the Christians laid out this platform and they say God has these characteristics, God has done these things. And then I can look at history, I can look at science, I can look at the evidence that's presented, and I can say that version of your God doesn't seem to be convincing, doesn't seem like he exists in the way that you say he does.
Okay. So, yeah, sure, you can do that. And if that leads you to believe that God doesn't exist, that's fine. Like, I'm not saying that you're wrong on that one. What I'm saying is if you're going to make the claim that God doesn't exist and expect other people to also see it that way, then that is still making some sort of a positive statement.
And I would never claim that God doesn't exist. You could possibly be an atheist and a deist at the same time. It's possible.
Okay, so define for me exactly what you think deism means, because maybe that's tripping me up right now.
Okay, the difference between deism and theism, a deist believes that there is a higher power, some kind of God that created the universe, but doesn't get involved within the universe. It's basically, I created this thing, I let it take its place, I'm out of here. Theists believe that God is actively working within the universe. He knows what you want to drink. He tells you where you can sleep. He tells you who you can marry. That's what theism is. Deist is, my God created this thing, and he let us do what we do.
Okay, so what you're saying is that you can believe that there's a God that just kind of went away.
And still be an atheist.
Okay. Yeah, okay, it's a fine line distinction because there's a God involved no matter what.
That's why I'm telling you. Atheists don't believe. Atheists don't claim there's no God. I couldn't prove it. I couldn't possibly prove that. Why would I make a belief in a statement that I couldn't possibly prove?
Well, I still think that's incorrect, though, because, like I said, we can be fairly certain, we can prove that things that are logically contradictory can't exist, like married bachelors, square circles. So I think all it would take is to show that God is a logical impossibility. And that's what, again, atheist philosophers have tried to do. I don't think they've done it well, but it's definitely an indication that people could try to disprove God's existence and show that it's not possible.
Well, if there's an atheist that made the claim that they believe there is no God in general, then I would have an argument for that atheist as well.
Oh, can I hear it?
Well, of course, I would say, how could you possibly make a claim about something you wouldn't even begin to understand? For instance, we don't even know what's outside of our known universe. We don't know how the universe came to be, or if it came to be. We don't know what caused the Big Bang, what was outside of the Big Bang. We don't know whether the universe created another universe. We don't understand these things yet. So how could you possibly say it wasn't caused by a being higher than us? Now, what we could say is, maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. But what we do know is there is no being that came down and killed the firstborn sons of Egypt. We could make that claim because we can historically account for that and go back and discover whether it happened or not. But what we can't say is we know what's outside of our known universe. Just not possible.
Well, it's so with the let me ask you a question. What do you think that if you were to define the Christian God, what do you think? What type of God do you understand us to believe in?
Well, I think it's subjective for one. I think many people go to Christianity with a different idea on what that God wants. But if I had to sum it up, I think most Christians believe in a God that is merciful, just. He created the entire universe. He has expectations for you, a plan for you. And if you deviate from that plan or do things against his will, that's considered a sin. And therefore, in order to appease this God and to be accepted, you must accept that his son, Jesus Christ, came to earth, died for you, and you must go forth and sin no more, at least possibly.
Okay.
And okay, that's kind of like my summary.
So, and now I just want to see if I'm understanding you correctly. Now, you said it's not possible to know that something that exists outside the universe doesn't exist, right? Like you said that it's just not possible to figure.
At this moment, we don't have what it takes. Yes.
Okay, so like one of the things that Christians also believe is that our God exists outside of this universe. That's one of the things that kind of sets him apart from, say, like polytheism. Is he's not literally part of the creation. He's not like existing within space-time. He existed outside of it and then created space-time, right?
I heard that argument, but people also believe that God is everywhere. So he must be within the known universe as well.
That's an interesting point. Omnipresence, yeah, he exists everywhere. As a spiritual being, though, he's outside of time, and he can interact everywhere. It's not exactly like spatio-temporal the way we think everywhere. It's that. Yeah, sorry, my philosophy is a bit sketchy on this one, but
well, let me try to help you out. You're basically saying that God's will and knowledge knows no bounds. That he can basically extend his will throughout the universe, but he still operates outside of the space-time continuum.
Yeah. Okay. And we believe and that's what makes the incarnation to us so incredible, is that the second person of the Trinity, God the Son, Jesus, actually entered into space-time at that point as a human being, right? But until that moment, yeah, God can interact. He could. It's kind of the way I kind of imagine it is. It's a really bad analogy, but it's like I can interact with this computer that I'm talking to you on, right? And I can, like type on it. I can do things with it. Technically, it's almost like I can surround it with my presence almost without actually becoming part of the computer itself. That's and that
Yeah, I think that's a bad analogy because when people claim God is everywhere, that means he's also inside that computer. You would also be inside the computer. The computer would be a part of you also, because from what I understand of the Christian perspective, nothing can exist without God. God is literally in us all. Like, so I don't understand how God can be outside of space time, inside of space time, and neither be within space time at the same time. It's complicated, you know.
the distinction still though would be like sorry what I'm trying to say with it is that like outside of space time he's not part of creation, he transcends it,
Okay.
but he can still interact with it.
Okay.
So it's making that clear distinction between the creation itself and the creator. God can be interact with it, but you're not going to ever take a particle out of, the cosmos and say, oh, I just got a piece of God's fingernail here. Like, that would be pantheism or something like that, where
So
God is literally the creation itself.
let me ask you this: why does it matter if God is outside of space time? Because in comparison to polytheists or people who believe in pagan worship, why is a God that's outside of space time better than a God that's within space time?
Actually, I think you're the first person that's ever asked me that, so kudos on that.
Yeah.
Great question. I think first and foremost, it's kind of just important to make those distinctions, because some people will say that all religions are just teaching the same thing, and that like really when you get down to it, they all believe in the same God. But if somebody's telling me that they believe in a God that had an existence at the beginning of that exists as part of the physical universe, then that's immediately something that sets the God I believe in apart, right? And it allows for some differentiation and to be able to say we are talking about separate deities.
Okay. Okay, that makes sense. That makes sense.
And secondly, I think actually when, say, like Dawkins, for example, says that science has disproven God, it's shown that like the wind is not a god or the rain's not a god, right?
Yeah.
I think in a real and crucial sense, it has disproven polytheism, because I think if polytheism, where gods actually exist within the universe, was real, that's what we would expect to find. And
Well,
unfortunately, because the universe had a beginning, that would make the gods that existed within it contingent. And it kind of that would create the question, what caused God? Like, how did these gods themselves begin to exist? How did the universe? It still doesn't. Whereas with a transcendent being that's outside of it, he's not contingent on anything. He can exist eternally, and it avoids that problem of what caused God.
that's the reason I asked the question that I asked is because a God can be whatever you want that God to be. So if I was a pagan and my God existed within space time, I can still make the claim that, well, my God is immune to the effects of space time. My God chooses to exist within space time and not be affected by it. He can literally have the same qualities as your God, just without being outside of space time. And I never understood why a lot of people insisted on that argument to be evidence of God's existence, of the Christian God's existence. Not saying that you have made that claim, but I've heard a lot of people make that claim in order to prove the Christian God's existence. So I was just seeing if you had an answer for me on that.
I mean, yeah, people can claim all sorts of things, right? Like they can, but the question is there good reason to think that what they're claiming is true? And that's why I kind of went with what I said about the rain, the things that we would expect if God existed within this particular universe, and I don't think we find it. Therefore, there's reasons to think that there isn't this pantheon of gods. Now, again, I guess that's open for people to rebut and respond to it, but that's just off the top of my head what I think on that.
Okay.
Does that
Yeah.
make sense?
Yeah. I mean, of course, I can get behind that. I mean, I'm not trying to pressure you too much, and I don't want you to defend a position you don't hold. You get what I'm saying? Um, so let's kind of move the conversation on to a different subject because I don't want to beat a dead horse about uh, outside of space time. But what is your idea? Let's say people say Jesus came down here and he died for our sins.
Yeah.
Now, I know there's a whole theological argument about whether or not Jesus existed. Some people believe Jesus existed. Some people don't believe Jesus actually existed. Now, let's say I agree. Let's say Jesus was a person. Jesus actually did exist. Jesus performed all the miracles that you say he performed. Jesus was born from a virgin. How does any of that confirm that he actually is the Son of God?
Okay. At least if Jesus was doing miracles and, born of a virgin, right? That would seem to suggest that a supernatural world does exist, right? And that at least opens up the possibility that God exists, right?
Or this guy and his mother were extremely anomalies with nature, and we just can't explain it yet.
Okay, so you want to say maybe just something happened that science doesn't account for yet?
Could be. What if Jesus and Mary were both aliens that came to the planet and could do things that we can't explain with technology we don't have access to right now?
Do you mind if I read a couple of things? Just give me a second. Again, great questions, but I'd be interested to hear what you think about.
That's fine. I want you to, I don't want you to say anything that you don't believe by accident.
Okay. Couple of problems with the alien theory. Let's just even take it as far as Jesus's resurrection. Say, like maybe it's just something like that that's going on. Alien theory does not deny Jesus's resurrection or any of the miracles. It only seems to ignore to suggest that God's not the cause of these things, right? That seems. The life of Jesus differs substantially from typical alien accounts. Aliens usually arrive in a spaceship. Jesus was born on Earth. Aliens usually appear for a very short time. Jesus was on Earth for 30 plus years. The evidence that aliens exist is questionable. Scientific evidence, namely cosmic constants, indicates the high improbability for life to exist anywhere in the universe except on Earth. Plus, there's good evidence that God exists, intelligent design, argument for a final eternal cause of the universe. Therefore, Jesus' resurrection is better explained as a confirmation of his claims to divinity rather than an alien playing a cosmic joke. And the Christian might say the skeptic posing the alien theory. Let's stick with academic arguments for now. Once we're done with those, we'll get back to some of the more fun ones. Or yes, Jesus as the Son of God was an alien because he was not of this world.
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean that did cross my mind as you was reading it, but I wasn't gonna go there. But this we could play that same game with Jesus as well on the opposite end. Aliens usually come and stay for a short period of time. Therefore, Jesus stayed for 30 years, so it couldn't be an alien. Okay, most humans, if not all humans, don't die and come back from life. So the God theory or Jesus dying and raising from the dead is highly improbable. Aliens usually show up in a spacecraft, and that's where they come from. Jesus didn't show up in a spacecraft, so it wouldn't be an alien. Well, most humans, if not all humans, are not born from virgins. Jesus was born from a virgin. Therefore, it's probable that he didn't exist. Like, you can play that same game with the Jesus story on probability based on alien experiences from the past. Well, based on human experiences from the past, Jesus couldn't have did what he did.
Okay, so I agree with you that miracles, by their nature, are improbable if they happen naturally. Yeah, we know people don't naturally give birth if they're virgins. We know that they don't naturally come back to life after being dead 3 days. But that's actually kind of a straw man of the Christian position, if that's what anybody is arguing. We're saying, because we're not claiming any stuff happened naturally. We're saying that it's a supernatural event. Now, I've given reasons why I don't think it's an alien. And like I said, there's reasons to think even scientifically aliens don't exist. So if it's not aliens, then what's the next best explanation? Well, I would think, given the claims that Jesus made, and that, like, for example, that he is God himself, that he is the Son of God, that the one person that would have the most interest in doing it, if his claims are true, are God.
No. Satan. Satan has a much better claim than God, because Satan comes to deceive us. Satan comes to destroy the souls of men. Satan also can perform miracles. Satan can also deceive human beings. If anybody had a more motivation to deceive masses of populations, it would be Satan.
Satan can't bring people back to life, though.
Says who? I never read anywhere theologically or in the Bible where Satan could not raise the dead. And God gave Satan dominion and power over the earth. Are we not of the earth?
We are of the earth, but
it's possible. Look, I'm not telling you to say that it actually happened, but there is a slither of possibility that could be an explanation.
I think God would intervene at that point, though, if Satan was actually... Okay, for sure. It says that Satan can do miracles and counterfeits and whatnot. On the other hand, though, I think
God would interfere.
Would intervene at that point. Maybe.
Well, I can explain to you why I don't think God would have intervened at that point. For instance, God didn't intervene when the serpent told Adam and Eve to eat of the fruit. God also didn't intervene when Satan was destroying Job's life and killing his children and so forth. He also didn't intervene then. Every account that we have of Satan in the Bible, God doesn't intervene. If anything, we have verification that God actually prompts Satan to tempt Job in the Bible. So what if this is one big cosmic test? Go down, Satan, bring your son up, let him do miracles, let him convince people that he is the Son of God. And those who choose not to believe in Jesus Christ are really the ones who are my children. Like Job, not cursing God.
Okay. So at this point, like I said, Jesus himself claims to be God.
Which Satan would do.
Jesus was actually accused of doing everything by the power of Satan.
And the people who would know is the people that was there in the day and time.
Dang, this is actually a question I haven't run into before. So yeah,
it's something I've never asked before. I'm more off the fly kind of guy. I kind of let these things come out as they do.
Sorry, I'm not giving a better answer.
It's okay. It's okay, because this is not something that you have to answer now. I'm pretty sure that somebody's probably thought of this and written about it and explained it. And that might be something that we could talk about on another episode if you get time to actually explore these ideas.
Put it this way. I think this is off the top of my head, this would be my response, I guess. Jesus says, by your fruit, you will know somebody. Now we know Satan comes to steal, kill, and destroy. Jesus, in his life, came and he healed people. He showed people grace and compassion. He taught people to be truthful. He taught people to love their neighbors instead of curse them. He taught them to love your enemies. He taught you to go the extra mile. Like, most people agree that Jesus had an impeccable moral character. I know that Hitchens and Dawkins had a couple of mean things to say about him and his mother, but in general, like, people agree that he was a very great moral teacher. And I think at the very least, if Satan was behind him, we wouldn't see that. I think we would see somebody that was trying to lead people to destruction that way.
Okay, well, a few points. Satan was the angel of light, or the morning star. So, beautiful. Jesus did also say, if you don't have a sword, sell your cloak and buy one. Jesus also said that those who refuse to die for me, like, you, to love your mother and father more than you love me. When you talk about steal, kill, and destroy, how many people have stolen and killed and destroyed in the name of Jesus? Look at the Crusades. Look at all the things that the Catholic Church has done. Look what a lot of churches are destroying relations with each other. They're dividing each other into different denominations. And I mean, if anything, Jesus has caused more division in history than he has united people, but he also caused a lot of division in the history of mankind since he's been written about. Is that not the long game? Is that not something Satan would want to use to really deceive mankind?
So the question I always kind of come back to with that is, like, ideologies, would you agree or disagree? I guess ideologies can be abused.
Of course.
So in that case, is it at least possible that Christ put forward a good ideology, but that Satan twisted that ideology?
It is possible. I'm willing to give you that. If you're willing to give me that, it's possible that it was Satan playing all from the start.
I can grant that it's possible. Yeah, we can both agree probably anything's possible, right? Now, the question is then, we look at Jesus's teachings. You mentioned, he said, buy a cloak, sell your cloak.
Yeah.
So in the first place, I mean, that's him just talking to his disciples right before they go to the garden, before he's arrested. That's not a command that he was giving to every Christian ever. I don't have a cloak and I have no way of getting a sword. Like, there's just no way that I could follow that. And I don't know what the exact reason why he did that was. Like, there's some commentaries that they have suggestions on it. I'm not familiar with those. But as far as that goes, it's not like something that, it's a description in a biography of what Jesus says. It's not necessarily always a command for everybody to follow.
Okay.
What Jesus did command, though, was to love your enemies. He taught that all humans have intrinsic dignity and value. He said, he's had his followers saying, it's not our job to judge people outside of the church. It's only people within the church that we have a right to say, ethically, you shouldn't be doing this or should be doing this, right? If all of that is true, to me, it would seem that when Christians were going out and killing people that weren't believers, or they were, torturing people in the Inquisitions or the witch hunts, I would say they were definitely going against Christ's teachings, not in accordance with it.
So if I went into the Bible and I found out all the scriptures that refer to Jesus, and somebody could take those same scriptures and it justifies what they did. For instance, when Jesus said, I've come to turn a man against his father, and a father against his son, and a mother against her daughter, I've come to, bring division. I could take that same verse and I could justify some of those things that you just named. Or when Jesus, like he said, sell your cloak and buy a sword. Or he also said, those who are willing to lay their life down for me. There are many verses where Jesus has said something that could be interpreted as,
It could definitely be interpreted that way. I get you.
So we pick and choose which ones we like based on our intrinsic values already. And we say this lines up with more of the picture that I want to paint of Jesus. But Jesus went in and flipped over tables and caught tantrums. I mean, there are plenty of things that Jesus did that could be considered okay,
a little bit scary, yeah. So can I it's a little bit of a backtrack, but can I try to use a historical example here for a second?
Cool.
How familiar are you with the French Revolution?
Well, the French Revolution, I know I'm pretty familiar with it for what I've been told. I'm pretty sure there's not, But...
So that was a fairly secular revolution. Like there wasn't anything religious that was going on really with it. But the principles that they were using were liberty and equality. Some of the worst atrocities in history, some of them were in the French Revolution, and they were done in the name of those things. In fact, one woman that was going to the guillotine is recorded as saying, "Oh, liberty, what horrible things are done in your name."
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I don't think, if I remember anything from the Gong Show that was that talk about American politics that we were both in a couple of weeks ago, I kind of got the impression you're a fan of like liberty and equality for people. Like kind of got, even though these things have been abused, you still see those as intrinsically good.
Not necessarily.
No? Okay.
No, I'm a nihilist, but from my perspective is everything's relative. Everything's relative. It's only as good as the people who practice it. Just like Christianity. I think there are good people who are Christians and there are bad people who are Christians. I don't think Christianity makes you a better person. I think you're a good person before Christianity and you just happen to find Christianity as an outlet of expressing who you are as a person. But I get that with Christianity. I think Christianity is good for a lot of people. And I think it's bad for a lot of people also. I don't think the religion itself is good or bad. I just think that people can use it in a good way or a bad way. So that's what I would say about Jesus. I think it can be interpreted either way. And that's one of the problems I have with religion is because it's not like science. It's not like if we find out we're wrong about this, we can throw it out and replace it with something better. Religion is, this is what you have. And if somebody wants to go in there and see this verse, I mean, they have all the justification they need. You can't throw that verse out and say, nope, we're taking this verse and we're getting rid of it forever. You can't do that.
No, you definitely can't get rid of the verse, but there is a sort of science that goes into biblical studies. Have you ever heard of the term hermeneutics?
Mm-hmm.
And like, not all interpretations are created equal. Like, let's say you wrote a book where you said, I'm an atheist. If I went around and started saying, hey, Javier just wrote a book claiming he's a Christian, I don't think anybody would say that that's a good interpretation of it, right?
Yeah.
Now, with all of that, so just to tie it in, my French Revolution comment was to say, look, even good things that are good, whether they're intrinsically good or you want to say they're just like the values we give them, like liberty and equality seem to be in general good things, even though they've been abused, right? And it shows that something that is good can be abused. Now going to Jesus's teachings. Again, Jesus wasn't commanding even the division that he's talking about. He says he's going to cause it. Okay, granted. How do I take that? Well, the thing is that if, let's say, let's look at what happened within the early church itself. there were examples of people following Christ and their families turned on them. There were people who had their neighbors turn on them. It wasn't because these people were actively going out and trying to cause division with these people. It was that they started proclaiming a message that other people didn't like, and they turned on him.
Which it happens with every other new religion. Every other new religion, when you start preaching something that people don't agree with, it naturally follows. I mean, I don't think it was something unique in Jesus' case, but let me draw it back to this. Look, I only propose a theory. I'm not saying that Jesus is the son of Satan, or I'm only saying that it's probable. But with that being said,
I don't know if probable.
Yeah. Okay. So it's possible. So I'm trying to get to this, and you can help me get here because I know we're running out of time.
So keep going.
So with Jesus, you were saying that some interpretations are better than others.
Yeah.
Now, from my understanding, and I really think this, I think apologetics, I think that people who make religion more complicated or try to make it more complex than it actually is, like the theological studies and stuff like that, I really honestly think it defeats the purpose of religion. I think religion was supposed to be like, come as a baby. Basically, like, faith without evidence is like purer than people who have to try to justify everything that they believe. And the average person can't study these things. The average person can't go to theology school and learn everything that you're learning, but they just believe. So I think that it dilutes religion because I don't think religion was ever meant to be something that was considered an elective in college. You know what I mean?
See, I would disagree, and here's a couple of reasons why. Like, first and foremost, 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says to this church that I handed on to you as of first importance what I received. And then he talks about Christ's resurrection. And he says, he died for our sins, he was buried, he rose on the third day, he appeared to all of these people. And he says, some of these people are still alive. And what Paul's doing there is it's a recognized Greek form of kind of like giving a bit, it's an appeal to eyewitnesses in order to give historical credibility to what you're saying. And so Paul was already using an intellectual form of his day to give legitimacy to what he was saying. And then in 1 Corinthians 17:19, what he says is, if Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile and you are still in your sins. If for this life only we have hoped in Christ, we are of all people most to be pitied. And so Paul's not saying there, hold on by the skin of your teeth and believe anyways, even if it's all false. He's saying our faith is historically grounded, but if you have reason to think that it's not true, don't keep following it because it's pointless.
And Paul and the people that was living back then had way less information than you have currently right now. Paul didn't have a Bible. He didn't have all the books combined and put together. He didn't have theological studies to back him up. He didn't have science that theologians or apologetics use to say, well, this is statistically more likely to happen because of this reason. They didn't have any of that. They were basically acting off a minute bit of information.
But what he actually has here is a Christian creed that goes back to within 2 or 3 years of Jesus's crucifixion. And it lays out exactly what was being preached from the beginning. And so they had enough information to know that this is what was the most important part about Jesus's life. And it was all grounded in history, so it was all falsifiable at that time.
So
it's different than...
Which is another problem. Basically, we have these books in the Talmud that says when the Christ comes, these things are going to happen. And if I have access to that... You said that again?
Sorry, this is saying this has already happened.
Yeah, but before Jesus came, there was prophecies of the Christ coming and like riding on a donkey into the city, like things that Christ did that was already prophesied about before. So if I'm a person trying to fulfill a prophecy and I have access to the prophecy, why would I not replicate what the prophecy says I'm going to do?
You might try to. I think somebody did the odds on this. If somebody being able to fulfill all the prophecies is like very high, the way that Jesus did, the odds against it are very big. And there's some things that Jesus didn't even have control over, like where he was born, who he was born to. Like there's lots of things that he didn't actually have any control over. And if atheism's true, he definitely didn't have any control over rising from the dead. But
But you can fabricate those things. You can say that Jesus was born of a virgin, but there was no way to prove that she was a virgin. There was no scientific way of deciding whether or not Mary was a virgin when Christ was born. You can simply say, I was born from a virgin. I mean, there's no way to prove he was wrong. I mean, or that Jesus rose from the dead. I mean, there are a lot of accounts right now where people see people that died 2 years ago and they hallucinate. I mean, there are mass people. All you have is somebody wrote down that this many people saw Jesus, but there's no real evidence that they actually saw Jesus.
well, I mean, obviously, I was going to say it's probably redundant, but I disagree with you on that. But um,
You have to trust their word. You have to trust the people who wrote this. I mean, that's all you have. We don't have videotape.
which is also true of most historical documents back in the day.
True, but those historical documents don't determine, like, whether or not Hitler existed or not, which I have video of Hitler. But if only somebody wrote down what Hitler did, Hitler doesn't affect my life one way or the other. If he existed, he existed. That's what it is. But I'm not staking my life or my future on the words of what somebody wrote about Hitler.
I
Does
agree.
that make sense? So
The
it falls in
implications
the,
are bigger.
of
Uh,
course.
but, for example, let's just, like, there's things about Christ's life that even non-Christian scholars who study it agree on. There's things like the fact that he was crucified, um, the fact that he was buried, that at least his tomb was found empty, that his disciples believed he appeared to them, and that the Apostle Paul was a convert to Christianity. Now, none of those things in and of themselves are necessarily supernatural. People could believe that Jesus had resurrected and appeared to them. The empty tomb could have been explained by a bunch of different ways, like, but here's the thing. And I try to kind of think of it almost like a scientific hypothesis. You have a bunch of data in front of you, and then you develop hypotheses to try to explain it and see which one explains it best, right? So, like, one of my favorite ones is that has been come up with to explain away the resurrection is that Jesus didn't really die on the cross. That's one of my favorites.
Mm.
Now, this critique comes from an atheist, David Strauss. This is why he thinks that it's absolutely pointless. What Jesus went through, he was first beaten for hours on end. Then he was whipped with something that would have exposed all of his arteries, all of his veins, his muscles, everything, right? And
Yeah.
we know that that's what the Romans did when they whipped people. It was just a brutal practice. And the fact that Jesus was collapsing so much when he was on his way to the crucifixion was probably what suggested he was already in shock and his body was starting to shut down at that point. And then he was nailed to a cross for 6 hours. Probably had like lots of infections starting, maybe even pneumonia. Like, it was not a good thing. And when crucifixion, what happens, right? People, you don't die by bleeding out, you die by suffocation.
Yeah. For your
Right.
weight. Mm-hmm.
So the way that they knew you were dead back then was you stopped pushing up in order to breathe, right? And that's why they broke the legs to make sure of it. And then it also says that Jesus had a spear stuck in his side, up through it, probably into his heart. Most people don't survive that sort of thing. if I know anything from science, most people don't survive something like that. But for the sake of argument, let's say that he did. And 3 days later, he wakes up and he's like, yeah, that was unpleasant, but okay, I'm good now. And then he unwraps himself, pushes aside a boulder with nail-pierced hands, beats up the 16 Roman guards that are outside, because the word used for the Roman group, that was about 16, 17 guys heavily armed. And then he walks to Jerusalem on nail-pierced feet, which is probably a good 3-kilometer trip. And then he presents himself to his disciples and is like, hey guys, I'm back. And they're like, oh my God, a miracle's occurred. No, probably they're thinking this guy needs a doctor.
Look, I'm gonna jump out on a leap.
Sure.
I don't know. I don't know how much evidence would need to be presented to me to think that's a fabricated story. It's look. Is it possible? I'm all about possibilities. I don't know everything in the universe. There may be things that's possible that I couldn't even wrap my mind around. But I'm gonna jump out on a leap and just say I just can't be convinced of that story. Just not based on what I know of the laws of physics, what I know about human beings. And like you said, it has to be a supernatural occurrence. Now, the biggest problem I have with that story is the story changes within the Bible. Every time you go to the next book, Jesus becomes more and more divine. Jesus does things that are more, supernatural and more grandioso. And it looks like somebody saw the original version and started adding to it. I mean, there's a book called Jesus Mything in Action. And I haven't read the book, but I've heard plenty about it. And it seems like every book you go, Jesus becomes more and more a son of God than he originally started.
And so one of the things I would go back to is, would you agree, are you one of the people that thinks that like Paul's epistles are probably earlier than the Gospels?
I don't think much about it. I wouldn't know.
Okay.
I didn't look into the issue. Yeah.
Okay. Well, in general, that's what scholarship thinks, and even like that's something that critical scholars will point to too. This is from Philippians 2, and Philippians is probably about 30 years or so before any of the Gospels were written. Right. And this is like an early hymn, I think, that Christians were already proclaiming at the time. He says, "Let the same mind be in you that was in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, had the very nature essence, did not regard equality with God as something to be exploited." So he already has equality with God even in Paul's epistles. So this is before any of the Gospels. But emptied himself, taking the form of a slave, being born in human likeness, and being found in human form, he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. And so there's this whole thing, even in Paul's epistles, about Christ being divine.
Well, you have to take into account that a lot of these scriptures were translated and they had scribes who rewrote these things continuously over and over. There's even incidents where scribes added things into the text and they had to be corrected later and say, stop changing the scriptures. So we don't even really know how much was taken away and added to these scriptures as time went on.
But we have documents that go back closer and closer to the time. And even Bart Ehrman himself says we can be almost close to like 99% certain about what most of the original text said.
Well, I heard different. Look, I'm not. I'm no scholar. Like I know there's scholars out there that don't even think Moses existed. I think most scholars think Moses didn't exist, and most people don't think that Adam and Eve was real people and that the Garden of Eden was a real thing. And to even think about that and to go back to Adam and Eve not existing and the whole fruit happening, then you have to call into question the whole thing about original sin in the first place and Jesus needing to die. So I could agree with you. Look, there are things in this world that are possible that I couldn't possibly begin to understand. But there are also a lot that I just can't buy. And I just don't see how you buy the scriptures enough to put your faith in it. That's where I'm trying to figure out the difference between me and you. If we're reading the same information, what is it about it? What convinced you that doesn't convince me?
Well, the thing is like you and I both agree that miracles on their own are not possible. However, it's almost kind of like the reverse of it. If the best evidence seems to be that something supernatural or seems to point to something supernatural happening, then that itself would be evidence for a supernatural entity.
Yeah, but the only problem with that is we can't define supernatural because none of us have witnessed supernatural. We understand physical. We know what physical is made out of. We understand matter. If I asked you to describe what supernatural was made out of, what material would you provide me? How would you begin to describe it?
I'm not saying that supernatural itself. I'm saying it's a category the same way natural is. Like it's a framework. It's like we can say the natural world. Now we're talking about the natural world. Obviously, that's material, but saying natural is such a hard
distinction. Which supernatural could really just mean natural, but yet unexplained.
Well, it's possible, but then we have that's what I was going back to with like I looked at like I said there was those 5 pieces of evidence that even non-Christian scholars accept about Jesus. Now they don't draw the conclusion that it was a resurrection. They come up with things like, he didn't really die, or maybe it was a hallucination. But I'm asking, do these naturalistic explanations explain the data? And I don't think they do. I don't think hallucinations explain it, because it wouldn't explain the empty tomb, and it wouldn't explain why a guy like Paul would convert, because he hated Christianity. He didn't think Jesus was who he claimed to be. He wasn't in the right frame of mind to have a hallucination that Jesus was the savior. The wrong tomb.
Well, look, I could give you all those things. Let's say Paul miraculously just converted and became a Christ follower out of nowhere for no reason at all. But these things happen all the time. People change their minds about certain religions and become radical and commit suicide bombings for stuff that they believe, and willing to die for people or beliefs that they didn't currently hold. I mean, or let's say none of these things could happen naturally. It could be all a one big conspiracy. A very good conspiracy.
I wanted to respond to that first point you made with it, about other people dying for what they believe, right? Like, I'm not saying that necessarily like I wouldn't say people being willing to die for their belief proves that those beliefs are true. Obviously, I don't think Muslim suicide bombers prove that Islam is true, right? What I do think, though, is that it shows that those people truly believe what they're saying. Now, Paul, for example, said the reason he converted is that he believed that Jesus appeared to him. That's what he says. That's what his constant testimony is. And he puts himself right on the par with the rest of the disciples. And all I'm saying is, if we're going to chalk this up to hallucinations, Paul's not in the right frame of mind for such a hallucination, because he didn't believe in Christianity to begin with. Hallucinations tend to take what's already in your mind and kind of project those. But Jesus as a resurrected being wasn't already in Paul's mind. Secondly, people have, for sure, they see visions of dead loved ones, but it doesn't make them think that people are alive or physically resurrected. They still think they're dead. They just say that, maybe they're like up in heaven, or maybe they're like here on earth, but that doesn't lead them to say that these people are alive and physically back in their bodies. They still think they're dead.
So what about all the people who rose from the dead in the Bible, that the day Jesus came back and people got up out of their graves and started walking around? I think this was the day he was crucified. But they got up out of their graves and just started walking around. What about all those people? Why aren't we hearing volumes of books written about how my uncle came back from the dead and was walking around? Where are all the accounts for that?
So my answer on this might surprise you, but I think that is something that Matthew employed. It's, how do I put this? Have you ever heard of the term apocalyptic language?
Yeah.
Okay. Think about it kind of like special effects. There seems to be in
Oh boy. Oh boy. We going there?
Oh, we are. But I'm willing to defend this because you know what? I just had to write a thesis on this that involved this subject, and people brought up probably exactly what you're thinking right now. And you are not nearly as scary as a thesis committee. So let's say. um, basically, if you read Tacitus, if you read Josephus, these are like contemporary biographies are written near and around Matthew. When they wrote about things like the assassination of Julius Caesar or the Temple of Jerusalem falling, they surrounded these really important events with really crazy sounding omens like calves giving birth, the temple door shutting on itself, volcanoes erupting everywhere, right? And the way it, at least I understand it, is they weren't recording at the time like actual events. What they were doing was using an accepted literary device to say this was a really important event. And so when these things, with Matthew recording Jesus' crucifixion, he records all these special effects things around them and saying that Jesus' crucifixion was just as important to some of these other events that other authors are pointing to.
And none of the other authors wrote about that. None of the other authors said that the dead rose up and started walking around, which begs the question: how do we trust what these people wrote? What if Jesus coming back and showing people the holes in his hands and revealing that he was really who he said he was? How do we know that was a special effect? How do we don't know that people just after the death of Jesus, people got so emotionally overwhelmed and missed him and wanted to go out and spread his word? And how do we know that they didn't just incorporate him coming back and revealing himself to be a part of this grand importance of the story?
See, the thing with it is special effects language is used to show the importance of an event, right? So that specifically tied to the crucifixion. The resurrection itself is an important event in the Gospels. It's the thing that is the whole basis for the Christian faith. So what we would expect is that there would be a resurrection and then all this other stuff around it. If we're going to employ what I'm saying consistently. But also with this, unlike there seems to be evidence that maybe Matthew is doing what other authors did at the time. With the
death of Jesus is being the center focus point. Everything else highlights that. I get that. And you're saying the resurrection is the center focus point. So some of the stuff around it may be that, but not the resurrection itself. That actually happened.
And that's something that all four Gospels do say.
So all four Gospels do say. Yeah. I get that. But also, we know that one gospel is totally different than the other gospel. They add things on that Jesus did that wasn't said in the other gospel, but there are still a lot of similarities. So we don't know who was right. Well, I mean, we do know that one gospel came first, and then somebody else wrote the second gospel, and then the third gospel. So they're mimicking what was happening in the other gospels, but they're expanding the world of the gospels. So you can only trust the original gospel.
See, that's not entirely true because have you ever read Plutarch? Have you ever heard of him?
No, I haven't.
Okay, so he's a Greek historian who wrote, they're called lives, and he wrote about, I think, 12 or so of them, and they're all overlapping. They all cover the same events. They tell them from, like, one's about from the biography point of Brutus, another one's from the point of Julius Caesar, right? He writes their lives, and because they all existed at the same time, there's a lot of overlap. But you actually find a lot of the same types of differences between those lives that you find in the Gospels. Okay. So, like, for example, one of the differences people like to point out in the Gospel of Mark is, well, was there one angel or was there two angels? You know, Matthew and Luke seem to kind of be different that way. But actually, if you read Plutarch, there's a scene where, in one of the lives, a whole group of people goes up to one of the leaders, and then in the next book, it's only one person mentioned that goes up. And so it seems like it's called a literary device called spotlighting, where the author just focuses and talks about the person that's speaking. It's not that he doesn't know, obviously, that there was other people around. He's just focusing on the main character.
Well, let me ask you this. We got to wrap this up.
Sure.
Let's end it here. I'm not arrogant enough to hold what's supposed to be the word of God on the same level of any fiction or any other nonfiction work. If you're going to say that this is the word of God, the Bible, why should it be held to the same standards as other books when it comes to the writing styles on how this person said this? Because it causes confusion. And God is not supposed to be the author of confusion.
If you're asked, like, I've thought about this a bit. This is just Chris's opinion. Take it for what it is. God still had a message that he wanted to get across to people in the Bible, right? And there was a certain way of speaking that people at that time could understand. If God wanted a gospel, the story about his son told, he would want it written in a way people would understand it as history. Probably the best way for him to do that is for the Gospels to take the form of ancient biographies.
Well, it's not working. I mean,
but that's what people are starting to recognize them as. Even Bart Ehrman says, you know, like, they are meant to be historical, whether we take everything in them as historical or not. That's the way they were meant to be interpreted.
So, well, whatever the plan was, I think there are many people who are going to die and not receive the truth because of the way the Bible is written, and because we can go and have these debates where I can create credible arguments and you can create credible arguments, but people, if the Bible is true, there are going to be a lot of people who just don't get it. And I don't think that the design of it would have benefited majority of humanity by its design. But I'll let you have the last word, and then you can tell people where they can find you, you know, anything you want them to know about you, and we're going to wrap this up. So go ahead.
That's good. The thing with that is that there's always going to be people that don't believe something. Like, I would guess probably most atheists would say that the evidence for evolution is pretty good, and that, you know, people, if they really looked into it for themselves, they would probably see it. And that's what happened to me. Like, I used to be a 6-day creationist, and I looked into the evidence for evolution, and I read the proper information, and I was like, okay, they actually have a point. There's something to this, right? And I don't see it as any different, like, if people looked at the Bible. Like, yeah, people are going to come to different conclusions. That doesn't take away the truthfulness of it. It doesn't take away the what actually is true. It's, you just can't, you don't have any control over what people decide on it. You can only just put the evidence out there and hope that they come to the right decision. I think the evidence is pretty good, and I think that, like, even based on what critical scholars accept, there's enough to say that Jesus resurrecting is the most, at least, plausible explanation of the evidence. And maybe you can have me on your show again sometime and we can discuss it more.
Yeah, this is yeah. I mean, we can be here all day, and I get that. And I'm just hoping that when it comes to somebody's soul, I just think these things should be a whole lot simpler, because, you know, humans are not built to be taking in all this information to make a decision about their soul. I'm not saying that. I mean, there are guys like you out there who's really doing the homework and really figuring out these issues, and that's great. But there are a lot of people who they don't receive information on that level. And I think their soul shouldn't be at risk because, hey, that don't make sense. And they need to go to a 10-hour class to explain it. So with that being said, do you want people to find you anywhere? Do you got anywhere you want to plug?
Well, I'll plug the fact that I hopefully have a book coming out next year. It's responding to Bart Ehrman, and kind of showing both the evidence for the reliability of the Gospels and the historical accounts of Jesus in general. I've got debates on the Right to Reason podcast and Left at the Valley, so you can look those up. And yeah, I hope everybody's had fun listening to this. I've enjoyed being on the show.
Sounds good. You've been my longest host, so congratulations. And I think we need to do this again because I think we could do a much better job next time. I know we was kind of all over the place, and that's my fault as a host. But with that being said, I enjoyed you being here. So they came, they heard, they saw. Now run. Tell them we said it. And if they ask for us by name, make sure you say it twice. This is the Javier Javier Show.